She spent her life sacrificing for the people she loved, her family, her home, her future. But in her final months, a quiet injustice unfolded behind closed doors. A 68-year-old woman began growing weaker by the day. Doctors had no answers. Her strength faded, and the two people closest to her never left her side. When she died, everyone called it natural. Until one discovery changed everything. $1 million insurance policy, a beneficiary no one expected, and a truth so disturbing it turned grief into suspicion. Because this wasn't just a death, it was a betrayal hiding in plain sight. And the question is, did she know what was being done to her before it was too late? Stay with me, watch till the end, and subscribe for true stories they never wanted uncovered. Margaret Hale's life did not begin with comfort or privilege. She was born in a quiet coastal town outside Savannah, Georgia, where money was scarce and expectations were simple: work hard, endure quietly, and never complain. From an early age, Margaret learned that nothing was guaranteed. Her parents worked long hours, and by her teenage years, she was already contributing to the household. While others dreamed freely, Margaret learned discipline. Responsibility became second nature. In her early 20s, she married her first husband, a man she believed would be her lifelong partner. Together, they welcomed a son, Daniel Hale, and for a brief time, Margaret believed she had finally found stability. A modest home, a growing family, a future that felt secure. But that illusion shattered without warning. Her husband died suddenly, leaving Margaret widowed before she turned 30. Overnight, she became a single mother with a grieving child and no safety net. There was no roadmap for what came next, only survival. Margaret did not crumble. She worked relentlessly, taking on multiple jobs while raising Daniel on her own. Sleep became optional. Rest was a luxury. Every decision she made revolved around one goal: making sure her son never felt the absence of his father as a lack of love or opportunity. Eventually, Margaret found her footing in the real estate industry. What began as a risky leap turned into a career defined by sharp instincts and relentless determination. She had an eye for detail others missed, and a work ethic few could match. Over time, her reputation grew, and so did her financial success. But despite her achievements, Margaret never lost her grounding. Family came first. Trust mattered. Loyalty was sacred. She poured everything she had into Daniel: elite schools, extracurricular opportunities, vacations she never experienced growing up. To outsiders, it looked like devotion. To Margaret, it was repayment for the life she never had. Yet as Daniel grew older, something subtle shifted. Gratitude slowly turned into expectation. Conversations grew shorter. Affection became conditional. Margaret tried to guide him, to instill humility and discipline, but her efforts were often met with frustration or distance. What Margaret saw as love, Daniel sometimes saw as control. Still, she refused to give up. She believed time would soften the tension, that maturity would heal what distance had created. By her late 50s, Margaret had achieved everything she once fought for: financial independence, professional respect, and a secure future. But beneath that success was a quiet loneliness she rarely acknowledged. That longing for companionship, someone to share her victories and ease her burdens, would soon open the door to the most devastating chapter of her life. And Margaret had no idea the storm was already forming. By the time Margaret Hale met Victor Reynolds, she had learned how to live alone, but she no longer wanted to. Victor entered her life in her early 60s, younger by more than a decade, with an effortless charm that immediately set him apart. He spoke smoothly, listened attentively, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who seemed to know exactly who he was. After years of quiet nights and emotional distance at home, Victor felt like warmth returning after a long winter. Friends noticed the imbalance almost immediately. Margaret was established, disciplined, and financially secure. Victor, on the other hand, had a history filled with half-finished ventures and vague explanations. His past was peppered with bad luck, failed partnerships, and stories that never quite lined up the same way twice. But Margaret ignored the warnings. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Victor praised her intelligence, admired her independence, and made her feel desired again, not as a mother or a provider, but as a woman. That validation was intoxicating. They married quietly, and Victor moved into Margaret's home in Hilton Head, South Carolina. On the surface, they appeared happy. But beneath the smiles, subtle cracks began to form. Victor was attentive, almost too attentive. His affection often felt rehearsed, his concern perfectly timed. When Margaret spoke, he listened, but there was always a sense that he was studying rather than connecting. Margaret noticed. She always noticed. Yet each time doubt surfaced, she dismissed it. After everything she had survived, she wanted to believe she deserved happiness. She convinced herself that love, even imperfect love, was worth the risk. But Victor wasn't the only strain on her world. Her relationship with Daniel, now fully grown, had grown colder. He had developed a hunger for attention and validation, but offered little in return. Conversations often turned tense. Advice was met with defensiveness. Gratitude felt forced. Margaret felt caught between two worlds, one where she longed for companionship, and another where the bond she cherished most seemed to be slipping through her fingers. What troubled her most was how easily those two worlds began to overlap. Victor and Daniel started spending more time together. At first, Margaret welcomed it. She hoped her husband could bridge the emotional gap she struggled to close. Their laughter in the next room reassured her, or so she thought. But slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Shared jokes lingered too long. Conversations stopped abruptly when Margaret entered. Victor began siding with Daniel during disagreements, subtly undermining her authority in her own home. Margaret felt it before she understood it. A tension she couldn't name. A discomfort she couldn't explain. She tried to brush it off, telling herself she was imagining things, that she was being overly sensitive. After all, these were the two people she trusted most. But trust, once cracked, never truly heals. Margaret had survived poverty, widowhood, and decades of struggle. Yet she was walking blindly toward a betrayal far more devastating than anything she had faced before. And the people she loved were already standing on the other side of the line. The betrayal didn't announce itself all at once. It crept in quietly, through moments that felt insignificant on their own, but unbearable when pieced together. Margaret Hale began noticing the changes in Victor Reynolds first. He grew distant, distracted. Conversations felt hollow, his reassurances mechanical. When she spoke, his eyes sometimes drifted, toward his phone, toward the hallway, toward anywhere but her. The warmth that once drew her in had cooled into something calculated. Then there was Daniel. Her son became harder to reach, emotionally guarded in a way that felt new and unsettling. He avoided her gaze, grew defensive when questioned, and spent more time secluded with Victor. When Margaret entered a room, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Laughter faded too quickly. At first, she blamed herself. She wondered if age had made her paranoid, if loneliness had sharpened her fears. She reminded herself that these were the two people she trusted most, her husband and her child. But instincts, once awakened, refused to sleep. The realization came not as a single moment, but as a slow, crushing certainty. A glance held too long, a hand that brushed where it shouldn't. The unnatural ease between Victor and Daniel that no longer resembled family at all. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't confront them. She didn't demand answers. Instead, she went silent. The truth shattered her, not just the affair, but what it represented. The people she had protected, sacrificed for, and trusted without hesitation had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And yet, Margaret did nothing. Not because she was weak, but because she was thinking. Without a word, she met privately with her attorney. There were no dramatic declarations, no tears, just calm instructions and a quiet resolve. Margaret revised her life insurance policy. The $1.9 million that Victor believed was his safety net would no longer go to him, nor would it go to Daniel. Instead, Margaret named Ruth Alvarez, her longtime housekeeper and confidant of over 3 decades, as the sole beneficiary. Ruth had seen everything. She had been there through Margaret's grief, her successes, and now, her silent suffering. Ruth listened without judgment, spoke only when asked, and kept every secret entrusted to her. This decision wasn't revenge. It was control. Margaret never revealed that she knew about the betrayal. She carried on with quiet dignity, masking heartbreak beneath routine and composure. But beneath the surface, something far more dangerous was unfolding. Margaret's health began to fail. At first, it was subtle: fatigue, nausea, unexplained weight loss. She dismissed it as stress or age. But the symptoms worsened. Headaches became relentless. Her skin grew pale. Her strength faded rapidly. Doctors were baffled. Tests came back inconclusive. No clear diagnosis. No answers. But Ruth noticed something no one else did. Margaret's worst days always followed the same pattern. A cup of tea prepared by Daniel. A meal served after Victor lingered too long in the kitchen. A decline that followed moments when the two were alone with her. Ruth watched. She waited. She stayed silent. Until silence was no longer an option. By the time Margaret passed away at 68, the world believed she had succumbed to a mysterious illness. But Ruth knew better. And soon, the truth would no longer stay buried. When Margaret Hale passed away, grief filled the house, but so did something else. Urgency. Before the funeral flowers had wilted, Victor Reynolds began asking questions about the life insurance. He framed it as responsibility, as planning ahead, but his impatience was impossible to miss. To those who knew Margaret, it felt wrong. Too fast. Too eager. What Victor didn't know was that the truth had already begun to surface. Ruth Alvarez, Margaret's loyal housekeeper, had spent decades observing quietly. She had seen Margaret's strength, her heartbreak, and the steady decline that never made sense. After Margaret's death, Ruth replayed every moment. The whispered conversations, the abrupt silences, the strange timing of her employer's worsening symptoms. Then the autopsy report arrived. Margaret had not died of natural causes. Trace amounts of poison were found in her system, administered slowly, deliberately, over several months. Enough to weaken her. Enough to kill her quietly. Enough to avoid suspicion. Ruth went straight to the authorities. She told them everything. The tea, the meals, the way Margaret always worsened after being alone with Victor or Daniel, the behavior that never sat right. Investigators reopened the case immediately. Their focus narrowed to the only two people with constant access to Margaret in her final months: Victor Reynolds and Daniel Hale. Daniel was brought in first. The interrogation began gently. Detectives showed him photos, childhood memories, birthdays, moments of a mother who had given him everything. At first, he denied any wrongdoing, insisting his mother had been sick. But guilt has weight, and Daniel was crumbling under it. When asked why Margaret had changed her insurance beneficiary, his composure cracked. Tears surfaced. His story unraveled. And finally, he confessed. Daniel admitted to poisoning his mother. Not all at once. Not violently. But slowly, slipping small doses into her tea, her meals, over months. When detectives asked why, his answer stunned them. He told me to. Victor had convinced him it was the only way. That Margaret was controlling. That her death would free them both. That the money would give them a future together. Daniel wasn't the mastermind. He was the weapon. Armed with the confession, police confronted Victor. He denied everything. He blamed Daniel. He called the accusations lies. He played the grieving husband to the end. But the evidence was relentless. Receipts for toxic substances purchased under Daniel's name, funded by Victor. Bank records tying Victor directly to the purchases. Text messages filled with coded language and promises of a future once everything is over. The case was airtight. Both were arrested. At trial, the courtroom was packed. The story had shaken the community. A respected woman betrayed by the people she trusted most. Ruth's testimony silenced the room. She spoke calmly, steadily, recounting Margaret's decline, her suspicions, and the quiet strength Margaret maintained until the end. For the first time, Margaret had a voice. Daniel's defense argued manipulation, and the jury believed it. He was convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As he was led away, he whispered an apology that would never be answered. Victor showed no remorse. The jury didn't hesitate. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The man who married for money would never touch it, because Margaret had one final act of control. The $1.9 million life insurance payout went to Ruth Alvarez, the one person who never betrayed her trust. Margaret Hale spoke no accusations in life, but in death, her silence roared. Her legacy wasn't defined by betrayal, but by justice, and her final decision ensured that those who sought to profit from her death lost everything. Margaret Hale never raised her voice. She never exposed the betrayal while she was alive.